a few hundred meters from the German border. A vehicle rolls out of the assembly bay. It sits low and compact on 6 fat wheels. Its hull is welded steel, sloped at the front, squared at the sides, painted in a dull olive drab that catches nothing. No tracks, no great gun, no thick plates of layered composite armor. It looks, to anyone who knows armored vehicles, like a compromise, a machine designed by engineers who were told to spend as little as possible. 1976. A factory floor in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland, a small industrial town pressed against the southern shore of Lake Constance, and build something that would not embarrass anyone. It looked manageable. It looked modest. It looked, frankly, like something that did not belong anywhere near a war. And yet within 2 years, a version of this vehicle was rolling off a production line in London, Ontario. Within 15 years, it was patrolling the buffer zones of Cyprus and the streets of Mogadishu. Within 16 years, it was moving through the rubble of the Balkans, carrying Canadian soldiers into one of the most violent peacekeeping deployments in the history of the United Nations. It would fight in the former Yugoslavia, in Somalia, in Haiti, and on the sun-cracked plains of Darfur. It would serve the Canadian Army for 27 years without a true replacement ever arriving on time. It would become the vehicle that proved wheeled armour could go anywhere a NATO soldier needed to go and survive almost everything thrown at it. Its name was the Armoured Vehicle General Purpose, and it was the machine that carried Canada through the most dangerous decade of its modern military history. To understand why Canada bought a Swiss vehicle and sent it into the world's worst conflicts, you need to understand the crisis the Canadian Army faced in the early 1970s. By 1972, Canada's armoured force was in a state of managed decay. The country maintained a NATO commitment in Germany, equipped with aging Centurion tanks that were overdue for replacement. Beyond the German brigade, the rest of the army trained on a patchwork of old M113 tracked carriers and Lynx reconnaissance vehicles, all of them expensive to run, mechanically demanding, and burning through defence budgets that a succession of governments had no interest in expanding. The army needed 2 things simultaneously. It needed a new main battle tank for Germany, and it needed a cheap, simple-wheeled vehicle that regular and reserve units could operate without a small army of technicians behind them. General Jacques d'Extraz, appointed Chief of the Defence Staff in 1972, drove the solution. He wanted the Leopard tank for Germany. For the rest of the army, he wanted something far simpler, a wheeled vehicle, affordable to buy, affordable to run, standard enough that mechanics could fix it with parts available from civilian supply chains. A Canadian study at the time found that operating tracked carriers in peacekeeping recce roles cost roughly 10 times as much as wheeled vehicles, primarily because of track overhaul cycles. In an era of peacekeeping deployments and budget constraints, wheels made economic sense that tracks could not match. The Army opened a competition. 5 vehicles were tested at Canadian Forces Base Wainwright in early 1975. There was the American Cadillac Gauge Fever 150, the Brazilian Anguissa EE-11 Arutu, 3 French contenders, including the Panhard M4, the Berliet VVX B170, and the Savium VAB. And there was the Swiss entry, the Moag Piranha 6x6. Moag was not a household name. Motorwagen Fabrik AG had been founded in 1950 in Kreuzlingen by engineer Walter Ruf, who had spent the early post-war years building tactical vehicles for the Swiss Army. The Piranha prototype appeared in 1972 as a private venture, a 6-wheeled amphibious hull with fully independent suspension on all 3 axles, a twin-propeller drive for water crossings, and a modular layout that allowed different turrets and mission packages to be fitted to the same base hull. It was clever engineering from a country with no colonial commitments, no expeditionary history, and no wars to fight. Switzerland had not deployed soldiers abroad since 1815. The Piranha won the Canadian trials on the only criteria that ultimately mattered. It was the only manufacturer willing to license production inside Canada. The Cadillac gauge entry offered no local manufacturing. The French designs offered no technology transfer. The Brazilian Arutu was competitive in price, but its manufacturer had no established relationship with Canadian industry. Moag signed its agreement with General Motors Diesel Division, based in London, Ontario, in August 1976. The choice of GM diesel was deliberate. The London plant had decades of experience fabricating heavy steel for locomotives and commercial trucks. It had the tooling, the workforce, and the floor space to build armoured hulls without the multi-year startup delays that a greenfield facility would have required. The production contract followed in 1977, initially for 350 vehicles, later expanded to 491. The first vehicles were handed over in February 1978. Over the next 4 years, the London plant built 491 vehicles in 3 variants, all built on the same 6x6 hull. 195 went to a fire support configuration designated the Cougar, 269 were built as armoured personnel carriers designated the Grizzly, 27 were built as maintenance and recovery vehicles designated the Husky. Production was complete by 1982. The ballistic steel for the hulls was sourced from foundries in Hamilton, Ontario, a decision that had been contested during the procurement process by officials who questioned whether Canadian civilian industry could produce armour-grade steel to military specification. Test results proved that it could. The steel was rolled, cut, and shipped to London, where it was welded into hulls on the same production line. The supply chain was entirely Canadian from foundry to finished vehicle. The common hull used throughout the family weighed approximately 10.5 tons. It was powered by a Detroit diesel 6 V53T two-cycle turbocharged engine, producing 275 horsepower, a power unit that GM Canada fitted in place of the original MOAG petrol engine. That substitution was significant. The Detroit diesel ran on diesel fuel compatible with the rest of the Canadian Army's vehicle fleet, which simplified logistics across deployments. A petrol-burning armoured vehicle in a diesel army creates a resupply problem that compounds every kilometre from a main operating base. The GM Canada engine removed that problem entirely. Top road speed was 100 km per hour. Range was approximately 600 kilometres, sufficient to move from one end of a large peacekeeping sector to the other without refuelling. The suspension used fully independent coil springs on all 3 axles, giving the vehicle genuinely good cross-country mobility over hard and semi-firm terrain, though it struggled in very wet or boggy ground where a tracked vehicle would have continued. The hull was originally fitted with twin propellers and trim vanes for amphibious crossing at 10 km per hour, though these were later removed fleet-wide because the maintenance costs outweighed the tactical benefit in Canada's actual operating environments. Armour protection was welded ballistic steel, sourced from foundries in Hamilton, Ontario, approximately 10 to 13 mm thick at the front, 6 to 8 mm at the sides, sufficient to stop 7.62 mm small arms fire and artillery fragments. Nothing heavier, nothing more. The Cougar was the most distinctive variant. It mounted a British Alvis Scorpion turret, housing a crew of 2 in the turret alongside the driver below. Its gun was a 76mm L-23A one-low-velocity weapon, loaded with high-explosive HESH squash-head anti-armour rounds, canister anti-personnel shot, and smoke. 40 rounds were carried, 10 in a ready rack and 30 stowed in what crews called the wine rack behind the turret. It also mounted a coaxial 7.62mm C6 machine gun. The gun was never a tank killer. Its 76mm round could not penetrate the frontal armour of a modern main battle tank. In armoured regiments, the Cougar was a trainer, a stand-in for the Leopard, a machine that crews used to practice gunnery and armoured vehicle drills until they graduated to heavier equipment. Its orange-burning high-explosive tracer earned it a name that stuck in every unit that ever fielded it. Soldiers called it the pumpkin shooter. The Grizzly carried a Cadillac gauge one-man turret mounting a 12.7mm M2 Browning heavy machine gun and a coaxial 7.62mm C6. A crew of 3 sat up front. Behind them, the troop compartment held up to 6 soldiers, seated on back-to-back outward-facing benches with vision ports cut into the hull sides. Egress was through rear doors or roof hatches. It was a simple, serviceable carrier. It was never intended to assault defended positions. It was designed to move infantry quickly and protect them from fragments and small arms on the move. The Husky carried no turret at all. A pintle-mounted C6 was its only armament. What it carried instead was a hydraulic crane and a heavy winch, sized to lift and swap power pack assemblies from the other Avgp variants in the field. 27 of them were built to keep the other 464 running. It was unglamorous work, and the Husky performed it in every theatre the family ever entered. Now, before we get into where these vehicles actually fought and what they survived, if you are finding this deep dive into Canadian military history worth your time, hit subscribe. It takes 1 second, costs you nothing, and it helps this channel keep producing this kind of content. The Avgp family entered service expecting to spend its career in Canada. Cougars were issued to regular and reserve armoured regiments and to the armour school, where they trained generations of crew commanders before posting to Leopard units. Grizzlies went to regular infantry battalions that had previously moved on foot or in soft trucks. The fleet settled into its role as a cheap, low-maintenance training workhorse, and for over a decade that was exactly what it was. Then the Cold War ended, and the world Canada's army had prepared for stopped existing. In 1992, the United Nations Security Council authorized an expanded peacekeeping presence in the former Yugoslavia, where the collapse of Socialist Federation had detonated into a series of ethnic wars of exceptional brutality. Croatia and Bosnia were fracturing simultaneously. The UN Protection Force, known by its initials as UNPROFOR, required armoured vehicles that could protect peacekeepers in an environment where the parties were actively fighting each other and where a blue helmet offered no guarantee of survival. Canada committed troops. The Avgp was the armoured vehicle Canada had. Cougars and Grizzlies were painted white, fitted with the letters UN in black on their sides, and shipped to Croatia and Bosnia. In theatre, Cougar troops were reorganised into 7 vehicle reconnaissance elements, rather than the standard 4 vehicle tank troops they used at home, a tacit acknowledgement that the Cougar's gun was insufficient for the threat and that numbers would have to compensate for firepower. Canadian infantry battalions rode in white Grizzlies through checkpoints manned by armed men who frequently had no interest in being peace-kept. September 1993, the Medak Pocket, Croatia. The 2nd Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel James Calvin, was ordered to establish a ceasefire line between Croatian and Serbian forces in a disputed agricultural area south of the town of Gospic. The valley was maybe 20 kilometers long. It was full of Serbian villages that Croatian forces had been systematically clearing. What the battalion found when it arrived was evidence of a systematic atrocity in progress. Croatian forces of the 9th Guards Brigade, known as the Lika Wolves, had been moving through Serbian villages, killing civilians, burning houses, and removing all evidence of what had happened. Bodies were found in the ruins, livestock had been shot where they stood, wells had been poisoned. Roughly 2,500 Croatian soldiers stood between the Canadians and the pocket. The Canadians numbered approximately 1,000. They were outgunned. They had Grizzly carriers, M113 tracked personnel carriers, and C6 machine guns. The Croatians had artillery, mortars, and infantry dug into prepared positions. Calvin stood his ground. The Patricias pushed forward through the night of September 15th into September 16th, engaging Croatian positions in 14 continuous hours of firefighting. 4 Canadian soldiers were lightly wounded. Croatian casualties were estimated at 27 dead. A vehicle rolls out of the assembly bay on 6 fat wheels. The engineers who designed it never intended it to leave Switzerland's borders in anything more than a catalogue. The country that built it under license never intended to send it to war. The world had other plans. 491 vehicles, 27 years of service, 5 continents of operation, one peacekeeping mission after another that Canada's government committed to before Canada's military had the equipment to fulfill. The Avgp was never the right vehicle for what it was eventually asked to do. It was simply the vehicle that existed when Canada needed one. That is not luck. That is the difference between the army you plan for and the army you actually field.